Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Boris Johnson has renewed the controversial claim that Britain will save £350 million a week by leaving the EU, which can then be spent on the NHS. The Foreign Secretary was setting out his vision of what he's called Britain's glorious future after Brexit in a newspaper article. Labour and the Liberal Democrats say government divisions have now been laid bare and accuse Mr Johnson of plotting a challenge to Theresa May. Well, let's talk to our political correspondent Alex Forsyth. Why is he saying it now, Alex?
Well, this is a significant intervention. This is a long article in which Boris Johnson is making the positive case for Brexit. But he does make some controversial comments. He repeats that claim that Brexit will free up £350 million a week, even though that figure has been widely discredited. On the Brexit bill, he says the UK should settle its accounts, but it shouldn't keep paying for access to the single market and the customs union. And he makes no mention of a transition period when we leave the EU. Now, his critics say this puts him at odds with Theresa May. It shows the Tories are divided over Brexit. Those close to Boris Johnson say this isn't about a challenge, this isn't him trying to undermine the Prime Minister. In fact, he's tweeted saying that he is behind her, but he knows this will play well with Tory Brexiteers, some of whom think the current leadership is lacking vision. And it comes just a week before Theresa May is making her own big speech on Brexit in Florence on Friday. So this is in part about Boris Johnson putting out there his ideas, but it also shows he's not prepared to sit quietly in the background, and it suggests his own leadership ambitions are still alive and kicking.
Alex, thank you. Alex Forsyth.
The Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, has insisted he is all behind Theresa for a glorious Brexit after his article about Britain's future outside the EU that's been widely seen as a Tory leadership challenge. Mr Johnson repeated the claim made by Brexiteers that quitting the EU could mean an extra £350 million a week for the NHS. Labour said it all revealed the deep divisions within the government and undermined Mrs May's authority. Victoria MacDonald reports.
First it was there, emblazoned on the side of the bus, £350 million a week to be clawed back from the EU. Then it was gone because it was widely held not to be true. But Boris Johnson, a keen Brexiteer and now the Foreign Secretary,
the bastion of independence,
just can't let it go.
Given recent world events, Hurricane Irma, North Korea and its missiles, you would have thought that the Foreign Secretary would have been kept fairly busy in his offices over there. Yet, he has still managed to find time to pen a 4,000-word article, which commentators are saying is his attempt to move himself from over there at the Foreign Office to here, to number 10, ousting the current incumbent.
The article reads like a speech he might have given, and there are rumours that's what he had originally intended to do. Instead, under the headline, "My Vision for a Bold, Thriving Britain Enabled by Brexit," he writes that leaving the EU does mean leaving the customs union and the single market and the European Court of Justice, as well as taking back control of our borders, cash and laws. And on that £350 million, he writes, it would be a fine thing, as many of us have pointed out, if a lot of that money went on the NHS.
Well, a lie's a lie, no matter how many times you repeat it. I mean, he's behaving a little bit like a kind of amateur gambler who's lost a lot of money at the table and who's trying to get it back by doubling the stakes. But I don't think it's going to work for him.
It is, of course, all in the timing, and there are criticisms that the article has appeared just a day after the terror attack in London. It also comes days before the Prime Minister is to deliver a major speech in Italy on Brexit, and it's shortly before the Tory party conference.
Boris has now, with this panegyric, this eulogy to Brexit and a eulogy to himself, decided that this is his statement, this is his hat in the ring. Very clearly, he is now challenging the Prime Minister.
If this was a leadership bid, it's not clear what support he has from senior party figures, though there was some backing for the article itself.
He's painting the picture of post-Brexit Britain. It's, after all, what he was appointed to be Foreign Secretary to do. He's the finest wordsmith in the Conservative Party, and he's presenting the vision, and he's the right person to be doing it.
This afternoon, Mr Johnson tweeted, "Looking forward to PM's Florence speech, all behind Theresa for a glorious Brexit." But that was just 88 characters compared with his carefully crafted 4,000 words splashed across several pages today.
Victoria MacDonald. Well, earlier I spoke to David Cameron's former Director of Communications, Sir Craig Oliver. I asked him if he thought this was Boris Johnson's attempt to rally the troops for Mrs May ahead of her big Brexit speech next week, or a tilt at the leadership.
The reality of writing a 4,000-word article just days before Theresa May is going to give what's going to be apparently a definitive speech on Brexit is a real issue for her. Because what's going to happen is people are going to compare that 4,000-word article to everything she says. And if there's a gap there, or if it deviates in any way, people are going to drive a wedge straight through it and say, look, there's a split at the top of government. So I don't think anybody would say that this was a great thing. It also raises the possibility of a challenge to Theresa May's authority. And again, that's not a great look for a Conservative Prime Minister just a couple of weeks before conference.
I mean, is Boris Johnson just dipping his toe in the water here, or does this bear the hallmarks of the beginning of a coup?
I think it's him reminding people that he's there. If you look at the last few weeks for Boris Johnson, he's had quite a lot of humiliations. There's been articles in the press saying he's not doing the job of Foreign Secretary particularly well. There's also been people criticising him, saying he's no longer the front runner for the leadership. And I think he's reminded people today that actually he has a lot of power. The media has woken up, sat up and said, actually, he is somebody who's got a lot of support in the Conservative Party. And when he says something, the Conservative Prime Minister has to listen.
One of the astonishing things is the resurrection of the £350 million pledge, key to the Leave campaign, but even Nigel Farage admitted it was a mistake, that it was wrong.
Well, I agree. It's extraordinary to reassert the £350 million a week for the EU. It's been totally discredited. It is not true. The number is totally inaccurate. And the reality is that the government's already earmarked a lot of money for other things for when we leave the EU. So the idea that you can move the money that goes to the EU straight into the NHS column just doesn't work. So asserting it again really is pretty disingenuous.
But why is he doing that?
I think you'd have to ask him, but I think that what happened in Brexit and during the campaign was a lot of people invested a lot of themselves into it. They put their credibility and authority on the line, and a lot of them just don't want to accept that some of the things that happened during that campaign were just plain wrong.
I mean, how worried do you think Mrs May will be?
I think the reality is if you're sitting in number 10 and you're going to give one of the speeches of your career in a few days' time, and somebody's just written 4,000 words on the very same subject just days before who's your Foreign Secretary, it's not going to please you. It's going to concern you. You're going to be worried that people are going to say that there are splits at the top of government, and you're going to be worried that people are saying, hold on, there's people breathing down your neck. They're challenging your authority. That's not a great look, and people in number 10 will be very concerned by that.
One of the interesting things about it is the language. You know, it's a really tub-thumping piece. You know, you could hear it as a speech. We will succeed and succeed mightily. It's got more than a touch of President Trump about it, hasn't it?
Well, I sat down this morning and read it from beginning to end, and it felt to me that it was very much structured like a leader's speech at conference. It was basically, here's a big theme that I want to drive home. At the end as well, almost like a kind of peroration at the end about rousing the troops, and you could almost see the words applause at the end in square brackets, as if it was a speech. And I think that that's the thing that will really concern people in number 10, is it looks like a challenge to Theresa May's authority, and that's really concerning for them.
If this isn't a helpful intervention, what will Mrs May do about it?
I think what she's got to do is act as if she's not really particularly bothered about it, but and then give the speech that she always meant to do and try and assert her authority.
Realistically, is he a danger to Mrs May, do you think?
In terms of being leader, I think you're going to have to ask him about what his intentions are. It certainly looks like to anybody who's schooled in the ways of the Westminster Village that her authority is being challenged, her card is being marked. No Prime Minister wants to be in that position.
David Cameron's former Director of Communications, Sir Craig Oliver, speaking to me earlier.
Now, the Home Secretary has accused Boris Johnson of trying to undermine Theresa May by backseat driving the Brexit negotiations. The Foreign Secretary was accused of making a leadership bid after writing a newspaper article setting out his detailed vision for Brexit.
I don't want him managing the Brexit process. What we've got is Theresa May managing that process. She's driving the car, to continue the allegory, and I'm going to make sure that, as far as I'm concerned and the rest of the cabinet are concerned, we help her do that. This is a difficult moment.
So this is backseat driving, in effect?
Yeah, you could call it backseat driving, absolutely. But I'm very clear that the cabinet and the government supports Theresa May, that there's a difficult moment to make sure that we get the best result for the United Kingdom, but I'm sure we can.
Now we're joined by Neil Patterson, who of course has been presenting his Sunday show, and a bit of criticism that Boris Johnson has stabbed the Prime Minister in the back.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are plenty of people around, perhaps not the First Secretary of State, but there are plenty of others around who feel that the timing of this particular article is an issue. You know, we were less than 24 hours away from the attack at Parsons Green when that article first came out in the first editions, and it sent shockwaves, largely because we're expecting to hear from the Prime Minister later this week the most significant intervention that she has made on her vision for where the United Kingdom goes in the aftermath of the Brexit process. The Foreign Secretary decided not simply to deliver that at a time when, frankly, you know, all attention should have been elsewhere, but he also chose to be quite specific about what he wanted to see. There was no mention of the transition period, which we thought the Cabinet all kind of agreed on. There was, you know, the re-mentioning of that £350 million figure. You know, we do not pay £350 million to the European Union every week, thanks to the rebate. That figure is...
And he's dredged it up again.
Exactly, exactly. So, you know, the only way in which, as I put to the First Secretary of State, the only way that this could not be seen as undermining the Prime Minister ahead of her speech in Florence is if they both sing entirely from the same hymn sheet. And one suspects that's not going to be the case. I mean, we did put those comments from Amber Rudd about whether or not Boris Johnson was being a little bit of a backseat driver. Here's his response.
The driver of this Brexit process is the Prime Minister. That's her job, and it is one of the significant tasks that is obviously would set for her, for this government, that we have got to do the Brexit deal. And we are all absolutely determined to make sure that that's going to be the best deal that we can have, and the Cabinet is absolutely united on that.
So why is there such a difference between what he says and what Amber Rudd has said?
Well, within the Conservative Party, the knives have already been sharpened. They're currently just being buffed up to a gleaming shine ahead of the Conservative Party conference. And in a cabinet where Theresa May has, not many friends, and one could suggest a number of enemies, Damien Green is the closest thing that she's got to Bagman. He is her strongest supporter. He sits on an awful lot of really influential committees that have an influence on this Brexit process. And frankly, from his perspective, I suppose it doesn't really help Theresa May if her closest supporter comes out and suggests that the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, is shoving her in a direction that she doesn't want to go. That said, there are serious questions of judgment about the Foreign Secretary's intervention. He is no longer a backbencher. He is supposed to be singing from the same hymn sheet. And if you believe some of what is written in the papers today, Downing Street not only didn't get advance warning of this article going out, they would have rather it didn't in the first place.
But yes, so they said that they did, didn't they? So, yeah, who to believe?
Politicians saying two different things. Who'd have thunk it?
Exactly. Thanks ever so much, Neil. So, what will the PM do? Let's speak to John Rentoul now, the Chief Political Commentator at The Independent. Very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. Is there a division, would you say, within the Cabinet?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, the reason Boris Johnson wrote this article in the Telegraph was because it wasn't an article, it was a speech that he drafted in order to try to influence the Prime Minister's speech that's coming up this week on Friday in Florence, because he felt he was excluded from the Cabinet Committee meeting that discussed that speech. He was forbidden by Number 10 to give a speech, so he gave it to the Telegraph instead, and they published it as a 4,000-word article. So clearly there are divisions at the top. But Sir Vince Cable is engaged in a bit of political mischief making, because the whole point of the article or the speech is that Boris didn't actually cross any lines. He didn't actually say anything which was specifically disloyal to the Prime Minister or to the government.
But was this a leadership bid, would you say?
Oh, of course it was. I mean, the point is everybody in the Conservative Party knows or agrees in essence that Theresa May is not going to be leading them into the next general election. And therefore, the question is who will. So, imagine the delight on the part of other cabinet ministers when Boris put his head above the parapet, allowing them to launch their own leadership bids, as Amber Rudd did on the television this morning, by attacking Boris in gentle and slightly coded terms, but putting forward their own credentials for the leadership for when Theresa May does eventually step down.
And do you think that the Prime Minister should sack him?
No, I mean, I don't think she can, really, because he hasn't, as I say, he hasn't crossed any lines. He hasn't actually disagreed with government policy. He's trying to nudge government policy in a particular direction because he doesn't think we should be offering to pay anything to the EU at this stage. Which means, which I suspect is what Theresa May is going to do in her Florence speech, or at least that's what everyone expects. And he's trying to influence her towards offering not to pay anything. But that's not government policy yet, and so therefore he hasn't contradicted government policy, and he can't really be sacked. And I don't think Theresa May wants to sack him because she wants to try and keep the government together.
Fair enough. Well, a spokesman for Boris Johnson has just said the Prime Minister is leading the Brexit negotiations and Boris is fully behind her in getting the best deal. But of course, the comments that he made didn't chime with the Prime Minister, and so this does leave her weakened, doesn't it?
Well, she's not in a very strong position anyway since the general election. You know, she called an election, lost a majority, and has been extremely weak ever since. And so this is why we see senior cabinet ministers out in the press and on the television screens this morning, disagreeing with each other, but not disagreeing with each other enough to get themselves sacked. So this is all about tactical positioning for the succession to Theresa May, whenever that'll come. But I don't think anybody wants it to come yet. I think they want her to see Brexit through, so they're trying to influence her Brexit negotiating position, and that's what Boris Johnson is trying to do, but from a position in his own case of weakness, because he's been excluded from the Prime Minister's inner councils.
Well, you talked about tactical positioning there. What chance do you think Boris Johnson has of becoming the next Conservative leader?
Well, I think his star has fallen considerably. I mean, if you look at a Conservative Home poll of Conservative Party members published earlier this month, he's less popular than James Brokenshire, who's the household name, who is the Northern Ireland Secretary. And there are a lot of cabinet ministers who are more popular than he is. I mean, he used to be unique in British politics as the only politician who had a net positive rating in the opinion polls. He doesn't have that anymore. The stardust is beginning to wear off, and so he has to push himself forward slightly to try and recover that ground. But I don't think he is any longer the politician who can reach the parts that other politicians can't reach. He was a very successful politician as Mayor of London, appealing to young people, appealing to a cosmopolitan, internationalist and outward-looking city. But now that he's identified himself with the cause of Brexit, I think young people have rather gone off him.
And of course, is there a stance that, you know, he made these comments about Brexit yesterday, and many people have seen that the negotiations aren't going overly well. Will some who voted leave be happy that he has got this positive stance still about the future of the country?
Well, that's the line that's coming out of his cabinet colleagues is, you know, oh, that's just Boris sort of doing a bit of backseat driving and being terribly optimistic and cheering everybody up. I mean, that is certainly Boris's pitch, that he actually believes in Brexit, unlike Amber Rudd and Damien Green and all his colleagues who were on the Remain side of the vote. And therefore, I think he's trying to ingratiate himself with Conservative Party members who tend to be more pro-Brexit. But I think he's also trying to push Theresa May into a sort of a tougher bargaining position in her Florence speech, and I'm not sure if he'll be successful in that, because she's ultimately she is Prime Minister, even if she is a weak Prime Minister.
Indeed. Well, thanks very much for your thoughts. John Rentoul there, thanks ever so much.
Now, Boris Johnson has been accused of misusing official figures for repeating the claim that the UK will free up £350 million a week by leaving the European Union. The head of the UK Statistics Authority says he's disappointed by the claim. It came as two cabinet ministers accused the Foreign Secretary of backseat driving by setting out his personal vision of Britain's future after Brexit in a newspaper article. Our political correspondent Alex Forsyth has more.
Delicious.
He was at the heart of a campaign that divided the closest of colleagues. Boris Johnson made the case for Brexit then.
Is it not time we took back control?
And he's restated it now and resurrected an old row by repeating this.
It is perfectly true and verifiable that there is in fact slightly more than £350 million a week that we do not control.
It has been one of those weeks that has the likes of us slightly tearing our hair out. First, the Prime Minister warned we might drift into war if we left the EU, a claim that appeared to come from nowhere and to have only the most limited of rationales behind it. And today, Boris Johnson launched the so-called Boris bus with a claim on its side which has been ruled incorrect by, amongst others, the UK Statistical Authority. So, was he prepared to admit it was misleading? Well, I gave it a go.
Only a cynic would say he had half an eye on the future.
The pasty of independence.
It was launch day for the so-called Boris bus, though, to be fair, he was on it with Labour Eurosceptic Gisela Stewart. But the unofficial leader of the Leave campaign was in trouble almost immediately for this claim on the side of the bus. It may be worth reminding ourselves why. The suggestion, as you can see, is that we send £350 million a week to the EU, which could be spent on the NHS. But it's important to recall that the UK does get a rebate as well as money back in grants, which leaves the real figure at around £161 million a week. So was he prepared to admit this was all more than a bit misleading?
Let's deal with your arguments. One of them is on the side of this bus. We send 350 million to Europe. We don't, and you know we don't. No, we don't. You know we don't. Admit that that figure is grotesquely misleading at best.
I won't. I'll tell you why not. Because that figure represents accurately the gross sum that is sent.
But the gross sum is meaningless. You've got the rebate, you've got the public subsidy, so the true sum is 161 million, as best as anyone can get to it. Right?
Which is not in itself to be sneezed at.
OK, but that is the right figure.
But let me tell you why.
So you're wandering around this country with a dirty great lie on the side of your bus. OK.
And now £10 billion is not an insignificant sum.
I just want to focus on the true figure is 161 million, correct?
No, the true figure is £350 million.
In net terms, the real figure is 161.
If you take out the abatement and the money that comes back, the UK money that comes back via Brussels, the figure is obviously lower.
The head of the UK Stats Authority said today this is a clear misuse of official statistics, something that's angered Boris Johnson. But some cabinet colleagues aren't thrilled with the Foreign Secretary either.
I don't want him managing the Brexit process. What we've got is Theresa May managing that process. She's driving the car, to continue the allegory, and I'm going to make sure that, as far as I'm concerned and the rest of the cabinet are concerned, we help her do that. This is a difficult moment.
So this is backseat driving, in effect?
Yeah, you could call it backseat driving, absolutely.
Boris Johnson's article argued for a bold and positive Brexit, leading to claims of cabinet splits and attempts to undermine the Prime Minister. But despite the headlines, there's no suggestion he'll lose his job.
Morning, sir.
Although political opponents say he should be sacked.
It's a terrible situation, and it puts Theresa May in an impossible position. I mean, I just don't understand why she hasn't fired it. I mean, it's like a school that's completely out of control, and the head teacher sitting in her office, paralysed and impotent.
Publicly, the government says it is united about getting the best Brexit deal. And Boris Johnson's spokesman says he's fully behind the Prime Minister, who is leading the negotiations. But privately, there is frustration and some anger at the nature and timing of this intervention, coming less than a week before the Prime Minister's due to make a major speech on Brexit of her own in Florence on Friday.
Long-term challenge.
In an interview with American television, recorded last week and broadcast today, she described her vision for life outside the EU.
Some people look at Brexit and think that it was about the UK turning inward. It wasn't. It's about us actually looking out around the rest of the world, but ensuring we can control our own laws, our money and our borders.
Now it's over to the Prime Minister to assert her authority over Brexit, settle internal disputes and persuade her party she can deliver. Alex Forsyth, BBC News, Westminster.
He has been accused of a clear misuse of official figures after he revived the Brexit referendum pledge that an extra £350 million a week could be spent on the NHS. the statistics watchdog, said he was surprised and disappointed that Mr Johnson had repeated the claims. Tonight, Mr Johnson said he was surprised and disappointed about Sir David Norgrove's letter. Well, we're live now to Victoria MacDonald in Westminster. A lot of surprise and disappointment, Victoria.
Well, a lot of ruffled feathers, I would say, actually, Jackie. The Cabinet, of course, there have been a number who've come out today and chastised Boris Johnson over his 4,000-word article in which he laid out his vision of what Brexit should look like. And now we have the Statistics Authority saying that he should not have used that highly contentious, many would say untrue, £350 million figure that was blazoned across that red bus during the referendum. Money that the Brexiteers claimed that we would be able to claw back from Brussels if we left the EU.
Strong and stable. Strong and stable.
Poking fun at the Foreign Secretary, a Boris lookalike outside the Lib Dem conference in Bournemouth today. But while it might have amused these Remainers, the real man was clearly irritating Theresa May's supporters. The Home Secretary reviving her description from yesterday of Mr Johnson being a backseat driver.
I don't want him managing the Brexit process. What we've got is Theresa May managing that process. She's driving the car, to continue the allegory, and I'm going to make sure that, as far as I'm concerned and the rest of the Cabinet are concerned, we help her do that. This is a difficult moment.
So this is backseat driving, in effect?
Yeah, you could call it backseat driving, absolutely.
It is absolutely clear to everyone that the driver of the car in this instance is the Prime Minister, and it is the job of the rest of us in the Cabinet to agree on a proposal or a set of proposals, because it's a complex negotiation.
The irony, of course, that Mrs May rarely gets into the driving seat these days. But this was 4,000 words that could hardly be ignored. Mr Johnson preempting a speech she's due to give in Florence on Friday, in which she is expected to set out areas the government will now be prepared to compromise on.
I'm going to pass Brexit. I'm going to make sure that Brexit happens because the British people voted for it. And I think it's really important that politicians actually do respond and do listen to people.
So she may not have delivered a public rebuke, but this one came today from the chair of the UK Statistics Authority. Sir David Norgrove writing to Mr Johnson, "I am surprised and disappointed that you have chosen to repeat the figure of £350 million per week. Money Mr Johnson had claimed might be available for the NHS when we leave the EU. It is, Sir David said, a clear misuse of official statistics." Mr Johnson's spokesman replied that the complaint was only about this headline. But it took minutes for the Statistics Authority to respond to that, saying they stood by the letter. Well, I hate to bring you a he said, then he said, then he said story, but this actually is how it's unfolding. Just now, Mr Johnson has responded to Sir David saying that he is disappointed, surprised and disappointed by the letter of today. He said there was a telephone conversation between the two in which Sir David appeared to concede that he was more concerned by the headline and the BBC coverage, that Mr Johnson wasn't responsible for that. He says that there was a claim that he had said there would be £350 million extra public spending. This is a complete misrepresentation of what I said, and I would like you to withdraw it. So very strong words over a highly contentious, as he must have known, figure.
Victoria, thanks very much. Well, let's go back now to Ed Davey in Bournemouth. Mr Davey, isn't Boris Johnson actually as much of a danger as many say he is to Mrs May? He has a very clear, tough vision for Brexit, which will undoubtedly be very popular with many people who voted to leave.
You're right. This is a Conservative government totally divided, a cabinet fighting each other, a Foreign Secretary out of control, and a Prime Minister who's too weak to assert her authority over the Foreign Secretary. The Foreign Secretary is now under serious question. The independent statistical authority of the country is questioning the way he's been using statistics. And the way Mr Johnson is coming out to defend himself is frankly laughable. Unless Mr Johnson says that figure is wrong, if he says it was wrong to use it in the referendum, and apologises, then he might have a shred of credibility. At the moment, he's got none.
Well, let's talk about credibility of your own party. When you heard your leader, Sir Vince Cable, beg your pardon, say it's entirely plausible that he could be Prime Minister, did you raise your eyebrows or laugh out loud?
Not at all. He's quite right to say that. Politics is in a volatile state. We've seen, not just in this country, but in other countries, dramatic things happen, the unexpected happening. We saw, for example, in Canada, the Liberal Party come from third place to win with Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. We saw in France, Emmanuel Macron come with no party from zero place to win the presidency of France.
You have 7.4% share of the vote. I mean, what sort of a swing would you need?
Well, Mr. Macron had no share of the vote, so that's the point I'm trying to make. Politics is very volatile. We're right to be ambitious. We're ambitious for our values and our policies. Liberal Democrats aren't just distinctive on the European issue. We're distinctive on civil liberties, on climate change, on reforming our failed political system, of holding people to account properly. So I think that Liberal Democrat message under a great new strong leader can be very credible and can win power.
Ed Davey in Bournemouth, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.